The hiss of the plasma cutter was sharp, but it couldn't drown out the heavy, rhythmic pounding in Sergeant Marcus Wilson's chest. He tightened his grip on his assault rifle, feeling the low thrum of the enemy vessel vibrate through the soles of his magnetic boots. Around him, Chimera squads stood like statues of gray-clad vengeance, their own breathing a collection of soft, filtered rasps over the private comms channel. They were the tip of the Terran Defense Fleet's spear, and right now, that spear was aimed at the heart of an unknown ship. 5 seconds, the tech officer's voice crackled, all business. Wilson took a final, steadying breath. The recycled air in his helmet tasted of metal and ozone. His focus was absolute, honed in on the mission. Take the command deck, at all costs. A deafening boom shook the corridor. The meter-thick metal door blew inwards like a piece of tinfoil, revealing a dark, cavernous space beyond. "Go! Go! Go!" Wilson roared, his voice the first wave of the coming storm. The squad surged forward as one. They poured through the breach, weapons raised, ready for the immediate chaos of a firefight. They were met with an unnerving silence. No return fire. No enemy shouts. The vast chamber was lit by a sickly green glow emanating from rows upon rows of towering glass walls that lined the room. "Check your corners. Fan out," Wilson commanded, his voice edged with a new uncertainty. Something was profoundly wrong. His team moved with practiced efficiency, their rifle lights cutting sharp white beams through the green haze. It was a young private, Cale, who spoke first, his voice trembling over the comms despite his training. "Sarge, you need to see this." Wilson moved to where Cale stood frozen. He looked through the glass, and the battle fever in his veins turned to ice. This wasn't a command deck. Inside the pod, a being he recognized as a Zephrian was strapped to a medical bed. Their pale blue skin, normally so vibrant, was mottled with black, necrotic patches. Dozens of tubes snicked into their body, pumping strange, bubbling liquids. The Zephrians' large, dark eyes were wide open, staring not at them, but into some unseen dimension of absolute agony. A low, continuous moan was the only sound in the pod, a sound of suffering so deep it felt like it could shatter bone. For a moment, Wilson's mind flashed back to his last shore leave, the memory of a white sand beach on a colony world, the warmth of a binary sun on his skin, the clean, salty air. The feeling of a life far removed from the sterile, green-lit horror in front of him. The contrast was so violent, it made him sick. "Check the others," he ordered, his voice a low growl.
The reports came back, one after another, each one laced with more disgust than the last. "Another one here, Sarge. Same condition. 2 more in this pod." My God, there must be hundreds. They weren't prisoners. They were exhibits in a gallery of torture. "Saito," Wilson called out to the team's medic and tech specialist. "Get on that console. Find out what this is. Now." Saito plugged a data spike into a nearby terminal, his fingers flying across his wrist-mounted interface. The screen filled with alien script and shifting biological diagrams. "I'm in," Saito said, his voice tense. "Reading their logs. It's a testing ground. They're deliberately infecting them with engineered pathogens." He paused, his breathing hitching. "They're not trying to cure them, Sarge. They're cataloging their immune response as they die. They're weaponizing their biology." The final piece clicked into place. The full, monstrous scope of it all crashed down on Wilson. This wasn't war. This was desecration. He looked at the suffering face of the Zephrian in the nearest pod and felt a cold, clean rage replace his shock. He keyed the priority channel, the signal beaming instantaneously across the void to the flagship Nemesis. "Admiral," he rasped, his soldier's bark gone, replaced by a raw, controlled fury. "This is Sergeant Wilson, Chimera Squad. We're in, but intel was wrong. This isn't a military vessel. We haven't found a command deck or a barracks." He paused, taking one last look at the rows of suffering souls. "Sir, we found a laboratory. They're not killing the Zephrians. They're harvesting them."
On the command bridge of the TDF Nemesis, 1,000 light-years from Earth, the silence was absolute. The voice of Sergeant Wilson, raw and full of a fury that transcended distance, had cut through the professional calm like a physical blow. Every officer on the bridge stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the main holographic display where Wilson's audio signature still pulsed. The clinical, blue light of the tactical readouts seemed to mock the visceral horror of his words. "We've found a laboratory. They're not killing the Zephrians, they're harvesting them." Admiral Jake Sullivan stood before the display, his hands clasped behind his back. He was a mountain of a man, carved from 50 years of service in the Terran Defense Fleet. His face, a roadmap of past battles and hard decisions, was as still as granite. He didn't flinch, he didn't rage. The news landed on him with the weight of a collapsing star, and he absorbed it all into a cold, dense core of absolute stillness. He turned to his communications officer, his voice quiet, yet it carried across the entire deck with unquestionable authority. "Open a quantum entangled channel to High Command in Geneva. Priority 1. Inform the President I am invoking Emergency War Protocol, Article 7. The commander's fingers flew across his console, no questions asked. A moment later, the main holotank shimmered, and the face of President Eris Thorne materialized. She was in her office, the weight of leadership visible in her eyes, but she met Sullivan's gaze without preamble. She knew him. She knew what invoking Article 7 meant. "Jake, what have you found?" There was no talk of risk, no mention of fleet strength. The protocol bypassed all debate. It was reserved for only two scenarios: an active genocidal event or an extinction-level biological threat. "Madame President," Sullivan replied, his voice a low rumble. "The Ascendancy, they have met both conditions." He nodded to his officer. "Patch the feed through. The full report from Chimera Squad." As the raw, horrifying images from Wilson's helmet camera filled the screen in her office, President Thorne's professional composure vanished. She watched with a silent, growing horror that was mirrored on the faces of every officer on Sullivan's bridge. And in that moment, across the vast emptiness of space, the soldier on the front lines and the leader of his people remembered the same single story. It was a story burned into the soul of every human alive, a nightmare passed down through generations. They remembered the Great Crimson Plague. They remembered the silence of megalopolises that had once roared with life, now quiet tombs where the only broadcasts were automated quarantine warnings and the endlessly climbing death tolls. They remembered the fear, the kind of primal terror that comes when the air itself feels heavy with grief, when neighbors become threats, and when hope is a forgotten luxury. It was a disease that unmade its victims, a biological horror that left cities painted in the fine red dust of the dead. The galaxy didn't just turn its back, it built a wall. The great civilizations patrolled the edges of human space, their warships like vultures circling a dying world, ensuring the infection would not spread. Humanity was alone, screaming into a void that refused to listen. Then, when all hope was lost, they came. Through the cold, indifferent blockade, a small fleet of ships appeared. They were not warships. They were vessels of flowing, soft blue light, shaped like tears from a compassionate God. The Zephrians. They didn't hail or ask for permission. They simply broke the quarantine, an act of defiance against the entire galaxy. Zephrian doctors in their iconic blue enviro suits walked into the heart of the red zones, the epicenters of the plague, where death was a certainty. They set up clinics in the ruins of hospitals. They held the hands of dying human children, offering comfort where there was none. They worked without sleep, without rest, driven by a compassion that humanity had forgotten could exist. They fell too. The plague did not spare their kindness. The names of the Zephrian medics who died on earth were etched into monuments in every rebuilt city. But for every Zephrian that fell, 2 more seemed to take their place, their resolve unbroken. And then, after 3 long years of hell, the message came. A single word broadcast on all channels in every human language. Cure. It was followed by the formula, given freely, a gift with no strings attached. That single word triggered a wave of weeping across the shattered colonies, a catharsis of disbelief, of a hope so fierce it was painful. They weren't just aliens who helped. They became the Blue Angels, the saviors. They were the unbreakable foundation of humanity's most sacred vow, a debt that would be honored no matter the cost, no matter the time. The video feed ended. President Thorne looked up, her face pale, her eyes blazing with a righteous fire that matched Sullivan's own. The horror had been replaced by a terrible, unyielding resolve. This was not a political decision. This was a moral imperative. She whispered, her voice filled with a disgust so profound it was chilling. She then looked directly at Sullivan, speaking not as a politician, but as the commander-in-chief of a species that had just had its most sacred memory desecrated. Admiral Sullivan, you have the full, unrestrained might of the Terran Republic at your back. Your fleet is no longer a tool of defense, it is an instrument of vengeance. Her voice hardened into iron. Make them understand the fury of a grateful human. The Luna arsenal is yours. All protocols are lifted. There are no limits. Unleash hell, Jake. The transmission cut. Sullivan stood for a long moment, the echo of the president's words hanging in the air. He now had the authority, he had the weapons, and he had a purpose clearer and more absolute than any he had known in his entire life. He turned to his commander, his expression set in stone. "Commander," he ordered, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Get me a fleet-wide channel. I want every soul in this fleet to see what I just saw. They need to know why we fight."
The order had been given. On the bridge of the TDF Nemesis, the communications officer worked with a speed born of grim purpose, his fingers dancing across his console. Locking down a fleet-wide channel for a direct address from the Admiral was an unprecedented move, reserved for moments that would define history. Across the 200 ships of the Third Fleet, a single chime echoed in every corridor, every cockpit, and every mess hall, signaling the override of all other comms. An expectant silence fell. Then, the broadcast began. It wasn't Admiral Sullivan's face that appeared on their screens. It was the raw, chaotic feed from Sergeant Wilson's helmet camera. The entire fleet saw what he saw: the breached door, the eerie green glow, the rows of glass tombs. They heard what he heard, the soldiers' professional calls turning to choked horror, the low moans of the tortured Zephrians, and the final, devastating report from the team's medic. They're weaponizing their biology. The effect was instantaneous and profound, a wave of shared shock that rippled through every vessel. In the cramped cockpit of her starfighter, the Fury, Lieutenant Eva Spitfire Rostova felt the cocky grin slide from her face. Moments before, she had been joking with her wingman, buzzing with the raw adrenaline of pre-combat anticipation. Now she stared at her forward display, the image of a suffering Zephrian superimposed over the starfield beyond. The casual thrill of the fight died, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. Her hands gripped the flight stick, her knuckles white. She was no longer a hotshot pilot looking for glory. She was a hunter, and she had seen her prey. Deep within the armored heart of the TDF Avenger, Chief Petty Officer Jace Torn stood over the central gunnery console. For him and his crew, war was a clean affair of vectors, energy signatures, and targeting solutions. The enemy were red icons on a screen. But as Wilson's report echoed through the compartment, the professional detachment shattered. Thorne slammed a fist onto the console's casing, the metal ringing with his fury. The red icons were no longer abstract. They had faces. They were monsters. "Reload main cannons," he growled to his crew, his voice a low threat. "Armor-piercing plasma shells. I want to punch clean through them."
Aboard the hospital ship TDF Mercy, floating safely at the rear of the fleet, Commander Eris Saito stood in a pristine white medbay. He had dedicated his life to upholding the principles of healing, principles largely founded on Zephrian medical ethics. He heard the report and felt a violation so deep it was physical. He looked at his own hands, tools designed to save lives, and thought of the Zephrians, the galaxy's greatest healers, being perverted into instruments of death. He saw the faces of his human colleagues, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and a new, unfamiliar hardness. The Blue Angels had saved them from a plague of the body. Now it was humanity's turn to cure the galaxy of a plague of the soul. When the broadcast ended, a new kind of silence enveloped the fleet. The previous quiet had been one of tense anticipation. This silence was different. It was heavy, cold, and absolute. It was the silence of over 100,000 individuals from every corner of the fleet, becoming a single entity, united by the same memory and driven by the same cold, burning rage. There were no cheers. There were no battle cries. There was only a shared, terrible resolve. Through that deafening silence, the voice of Admiral Jake Sullivan cut through, clear and steady, speaking to every soul under his command. "You have seen the evidence. You know the debt. You know our purpose." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the shared fury coalesce into a single point of focused intent. "All ships, advance." Like a single organism, the fleet responded. Hundreds of engine bells ignited in perfect, silent unison, bathing the void in a brilliant blue-white glare. The great wall of human steel began to move, not in a chaotic charge, but in a slow, methodical, and unstoppable advance. The hunt had been sanctioned. The RAF had been unified. The executioner was coming. The human fleet advanced with the implacable, silent menace of a rising tide. There was no chaotic charge, no passionate battle cries over the comms. There was only the cold, unified resolve of 100,000 souls moving as one. The Ascendancy Fleet, recovering from the communication breakdown, saw this steady, disciplined advance not as caution, but as supreme arrogance. Warlord Krax, aboard his flagship Indomitus, sneered at the approaching Terrans. He would make an example of them. "Single out the lead heavy cruiser," Krax bellowed from his command throne. "I want its burning husk to be a lesson to them all. Fire at will." The chosen target was the TDF Avenger. Aboard its gunnery deck, Chief Jace Thorne watched the tactical display as the Indomitus and its two escorts turned to face them. On a small, secondary screen next to his console, he had Wilson's report from the laboratory looping on a silent repeat. The images of the suffering Zephrians were burned into his mind. He wasn't just aiming a weapon, he was balancing a scale. "Enemy firing solution locked on us," his targeting officer reported calmly. "Full salvo incoming." "Brace for impact," Jace ordered, his eyes never leaving his screen. From Krax's perspective, the volley was perfect. A storm of crimson plasma bolts crossed the void and slammed into the Avenger. The spectacle was immense, a cascade of fiery energy. He expected to see the human ship's shield shatter, its hull buckle, but when the light cleared, the Avenger was still there. Its blue shield shimmering, but holding firm, like a cliff against a storm. "Report!" Krax roared, a flicker of disbelief in his voice. "Their shields are holding, Warlord. Energy levels are still above 90%. Aboard the Avenger, Jace Thorne barely registered the slight shudder that ran through the deck. "Shields at 92%, he said, his voice flat. "Our turn." He looked at the image of the tormented Zephrian on his screen one last time. "This is for you," he thought. "Targeting solution locked on the enemy flagship's command bridge," he reported into his comms. "Requesting permission to fire main cannons."
The reply from his captain was instantaneous. "Permission granted, Chief. Give 'em hell." "Firing," Jace said. The main cannons of the Avenger did not fire beams. They launched projectiles, dense, compressed slugs of plasma that tore through space with the physical weight of meteors. Warlord Krax watched them coming, his tactical display screaming warnings. They looked different, heavier, more solid than his own weapons. His ship's powerful shields flared brilliantly as the human projectiles hit. But they didn't splash, they didn't dissipate. They punched through. On the bridge of the Indomitus, alarms shrieked. Krax felt a violent lurch as the first plasma slug breached 3 decks below. Before he could even shout an order, the second slug hit. It tore through the front of his command bridge as if it were made of paper. The last thing Warlord Krax ever saw was a silent, blindingly white light as the very air around him was turned into plasma. Jace Thorne watched the red icon for the Indomitus flash critical, then blink out of existence. He didn't cheer. He took one slow breath and let it out. "Target destroyed," he stated calmly. "Acquiring next target." That same scene was repeated across the entire battle space. It wasn't a battle, it was a reckoning. Human cruisers went head-to-head with Ascendancy dreadnoughts and won. Human destroyers moved with a speed and agility that made the enemy's targeting systems useless, striking at weak points before vanishing. The Ascendancy ships were bigger, more numerous, but they were brittle. Their technology was built for conquest against lesser foes. Humanity's technology was different. It had been forged in the crucible of near extinction, designed with a single, desperate purpose: to be brutally, overwhelmingly superior. The Ascendancy had come expecting to slaughter sheep. They found themselves facing a species that had, out of necessity and grief, learned how to become dragons. And now, for the first time in 80 years, the dragons were truly wroth. The initial human assault had been a brutal lesson in superiority. The Ascendancy fleet, arrogant and accustomed to easy victories, found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and systematically dismantled in individual engagements. Sub-Warlord Teth, who had taken command after the instantaneous vaporization of the flagship Indomitus, was no fool. He saw the grim mathematics of the battle laid bare on his tactical display. Continuing to fight the humans on their terms, in duels of speed and precision, was suicide. He had only one advantage left: raw, concentrated numbers. "All ships,
Teth's command roared across the Ascendancy network, laced with fury and a new, unfamiliar desperation. Consolidate. Form a defensive sphere. Overlap shields. Concentrate all firepower outwards. Let them break themselves upon our wall of steel. The scattered Ascendancy ships obeyed. They pulled back, abandoning their wounded, and began to form a massive, bristling sphere of warships. It was a crude but effective strategy. Hundreds of ships, their energy shields now linked and reinforcing one another, created a fortress in the void. Their combined firepower turned the space around them into a kill zone where no single ship could survive for long. The relentless advance of the human fleet slowed, then halted. The smaller, faster ships that had previously wreaked havoc now found their attacks splashing harmlessly against the layered, impenetrable shield wall. The battle had reached a stalemate. Aboard the Nemesis, Admiral Sullivan watched the enemy's maneuver with cold, analytical eyes. His tactical officers presented grim projections. A conventional assault on the enemy sphere would be a meat grinder. They might win, but the cost would be dozens of ships and thousands of lives. "They have built their own tomb," Sullivan said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this. He had hoped their conventional superiority would be enough. But the Ascendancy's desperation had forced his hand. He had been given the key to humanity's most terrible weapons, and now he had to use them. He turned to his weapons officer. "Authorize deployment of a graviton-class munition. Target the geometric center of their formation." The officer's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, but he simply replied, "Aye, Admiral. Authorizing. The TDF Hephaestus is armed and ready." The Hephaestus, a heavy, unassuming carrier, opened its central launch bay. From the darkness within, a single, oversized torpedo emerged. It moved with an unnatural, deliberate slowness, its hull a matte black that seemed to drink the light of distant stars. It was not a weapon of speed. It was a weapon of inevitability. The Ascendancy fortress fired on it. Lasers and plasma bolts converged on the lone torpedo, but it was protected by a unique, localized shield that absorbed the energy without flaring. It continued its serene, unhurried journey towards the heart of their fleet.
It reached its destination and detonated. The detonation was an event of pure anti-sensation. There was no light, no fire, no sound. There was only a sudden, perfect sphere of absolute blackness, a hole punched in the fabric of reality. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the universe began to scream. An invisible, irresistible force erupted from the black sphere. It was not an explosion pushing outwards, but a catastrophic pull inwards. The ships at the center of the Ascendancy formation were the first to die. They were yanked from their positions with bone-jarring violence, their engines screaming as they failed to fight the impossible tide. Two cruisers were slammed into each other, their hulls crumpling like paper, their reactors breaching in silent secondary fireballs. Further out, the larger dreadnoughts fought against the pull. Their engines flared to maximum output, entire rivers of plasma diverted to push them away from the center. But it was useless. They began to slide, slowly at first, then with increasing, terrifying speed towards the maelstrom of wreckage at the core. A dreadnought's wing was torn off as it was dragged across the hull of its neighbor. Another massive ship, caught in the competing gravitational pull of its own engines and the bomb, was simply torn in half, its internal corridors exposed to the void for a fleeting moment before being sucked into the chaos. The defensive sphere had become a self-consuming vortex of destruction. The Ascendancy fleet was no longer being fought by humanity, it was being devoured by its own mass. On the bridge of the Nemesis, the human crew watched in stunned silence. Their faces were illuminated by the hellish light of the enemy fleet destroying itself.
There were no cheers of victory. There was only a profound, chilling awe. A young ensign stared at the swirling vortex of death on the main screen, his face pale. My God, what have we become? After a long minute that felt like an eternity, the black sphere collapsed. The gravitational pull vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Silence returned to the void. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of a graveyard. Where a proud fortress of warships had once stood, there was now only a vast, expanding cloud of debris, punctuated by the funeral pyres of dying reactors. The Ascendancy fleet was broken. The survivors were scattered, damaged, their crews catatonic with a terror no soldier should ever have to experience. Admiral Sullivan looked upon the carnage he had unleashed. He felt no triumph. He felt no pride. He felt only the grim, ironclad satisfaction of a surgeon who has just cut out a malignant tumor. The procedure had been brutal, but it had been necessary. His voice cut through the silence on his own bridge, calm and resolute, bringing his crew back from the abyss they had just witnessed. "The formation is broken," he stated simply. "All ships, new targets assigned, the laboratory vessels." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the tactical map where the 3 massive laboratory ships were now exposed and vulnerable. "Advance." The order was given, and the purpose of the Third Fleet coalesced into a single, sharp point. The scattered wreckage of the Ascendancy's war fleet was now just debris to be navigated, obstacles on the path to the true objective. 3 monstrous ships, the laboratory vessels codenamed the Altars, now floated exposed, their escort screen shattered. The human fleet surged forward, ignoring the few remaining enemy warships that buzzed around them like angry, desperate flies. The largest of the 3, a vessel so vast it blocked out the stars behind it, became the focus of the main assault. Its design was a perversion of Zephrian aesthetics, its smooth, organic lines corrupted by angular, brutalist structures. On the tactical display, it was designated Altar Crime. To the human crews, it was simply the Progenitor. It was not heavily armed, but its energy shields were immense, a layered bubble of power designed not to win a fight, but to protect its unholy work at all costs. "All heavy cruisers, form a firing line," came the order from the Nemesis. "Concentrate fire on a single point. We will burn a hole through them." The TDF Avenger, its cannons still hot from its duel with the enemy flagship, moved into position alongside a dozen other cruisers. As one, they unleashed a continuous, searing beam of plasma, a torrent of pure energy that slammed into the Progenitor shield. The shield flared, absorbing the punishment, shimmering like a stressed soap bubble. It held. The few remaining Ascendancy destroyers fought with the fanaticism of the doomed, launching suicidal attack runs on the human line, trying to draw fire. They were swatted from the sky with cold efficiency by the fleet's point defense systems, but their efforts bought the Progenitor time. The siege was a brutal, grinding affair, a contest of raw power against stubborn defense. For 17 long minutes, the human fleet poured energy into the shield. Then, with a silent, rippling cascade of emerald light, it finally shattered. The hull of the Progenitor was exposed. Aboard the alien vessel, its commander knew all was lost, but vengeance was still within its grasp. It gave its final order: purge the samples. Across the monstrous ship, dozens of launch bays slid open. From them, a swarm of missiles erupted, not aimed at any specific warship, but fired indiscriminately into the battlespace. Tactical readouts on the Nemesis immediately flagged them. They were not explosive. They carried biophage warheads, a final spiteful act to turn the entire battleground into a plague zone. The TDF Vigilance, a Guardian-class cruiser, was positioned on the fleet's flank, its primary role to protect the non-combatant ships in the rear. At its helm, Captain Anya Sharma's face was a mask of calm focus. All point defense batteries engage. Firing solution, swarm protocol.
Prioritize any warheads on an intercept course with the hospital ship Mercy.
The Vigilance lit up like a star, a web of hundreds of defensive laser beams flashing out, crisscrossing the void. Each beam found a target, and the missile swarm began to thin, each biophage warhead detonating in a silent, harmless puff of vaporized material. But the swarm was too large, too dense. The ship's systems screamed warnings of overheating. "Multiple targets have breached the screen," the tactical officer yelled. "5 of them! They're on a direct path to the Mercy!" There was no time for the massive hospital ship to evade. Sharma made her decision in the space of a single heartbeat. "Helm, new course," she ordered, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "Place us directly in their path. All hands, brace for multiple impacts." The Vigilance was not a nimble ship, but its engines roared, pushing the heavy cruiser into a final, desperate shielding maneuver. It positioned its broadside directly between the oncoming missiles and the defenseless hospital ship. The first 3 missiles shattered against its thick hull, their payloads atomized by the impact. The final 2, however, struck near a joint in the armor plating. The ship shuddered violently. Alarms blared across Sharma's bridge, a chaotic symphony of failure. "Warning! Hull breach on decks 7 and 8! Multiple biocontaminants detected! Containment fields are failing!" The battle outside had reached its conclusion. With its final weapon spent, the progenitor was a helpless target. The combined firepower of the human cruisers tore into it, ripping it apart in a series of catastrophic explosions that finally silenced the horrors within. But on the bridge of the Nemesis, all eyes were on the lone, drifting cruiser, its red quarantine beacons now flashing like a mortal wound. Admiral Sullivan received the damage report from the Vigilance. The contamination was absolute and irreversible. The ship that had just saved hundreds was now the single greatest threat to the entire fleet. He opened a private, encrypted channel to the Vigilance. Captain Sharma's face appeared on his screen. She was calm, her uniform singed, but her eyes were clear. "Report, Captain," Sullivan said, his voice heavy. "We saved a Mercy, Admiral, but the Vigilance is lost. The plague is loose inside our ship. We cannot be recovered." Sullivan closed his eyes for a single, painful moment. He saw the faces of Sharma's crew, their sacrifice, their courage, and he saw the terrifying, unstoppable nature of the weapon they had just contained. There was only one option. The surgeon's creed demanded it. To save the body, the infected limb must be removed. "Your service and your sacrifice will be honored, Anya," he said, using her first name for the first and last time. "It was an honor, sir," she said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "Sharma out." The channel closed. Sullivan turned to his weapons officer, his face a mask of iron, his heart a block of ice. "Target the TDF Vigilance," he commanded, his voice a whisper of gravel and grief. "Main cannons, fire until there is nothing left but dust." As the rest of the fleet began the grim task of hunting down the last 2 laboratory ships, the TDF Nemesis turned its awesome power not on an enemy, but on one of its own. The great plasma cannons fired, and the heroic cruiser that had saved so many vanished in a silent, purifying fire, the terrible, necessary price of their victory. The last explosion faded, leaving behind a silence more profound than any sound. Where a battle had raged, there was now only a graveyard. The space between the stars was littered with the dead, a vast, slowly expanding cloud of twisted metal, shattered armor plating, and the frozen, glittering dust of vaporized ships. Shards of what were once mighty vessels drifted like broken glass on black velvet, catching the light of the distant Kepler sun in silent, mournful flashes. The Ascendancy fleet had ceased to exist. Aboard the bridge of the TDF Nemesis, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and exhaustion. The adrenaline of combat had evaporated, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary fatigue. Officers moved with a heavy slowness, their faces grim, their eyes staring at the debris field on the main screen. There was no celebration. There was no triumph. The price of this victory had been too high, paid for with the purifying fire that had consumed the TDF Vigilance and its heroic crew. That final, necessary act had scoured all joy from their success. Admiral Jake Sullivan stood before the main view screen, his gaze sweeping over the destruction he had ordered. He saw the remnants of the enemy, and he felt nothing but a cold, grim satisfaction. But when his eyes passed over the empty sector of space where the Vigilance had made its last stand, he felt the immense weight of command settle upon him. He had won the battle. He had saved the Zephrians. But he had also given the order to kill his own people. The victory was clean, but his hands felt stained. "Damage reports," he asked, his voice a low gravel breaking the somber silence. "Minimal, Admiral," his commander replied. "Aside from the Vigilance, our losses were light. The fleet is operational." "Good," Sullivan said, his eyes still fixed on the void. "Begin rescue operations. I want medical teams on every captured station and derelict that might hold survivors. Move!" The bridge came alive with a new, more hopeful purpose. The battle was over. The healing could begin.
The rescue shuttles descended into the ruined structures like doves into a storm-racked city. Dr. Alani Petrova led her medical team through the scarred corridors of what was once a Zephrian orbital research station. The Marines of Chimera Squad, including a grimly silent Sergeant Wilson, provided cover, their rifles sweeping every corner. The air was cold, thin, and smelled of fear. They found the first group of survivors huddled at darkened cargo bay. Dozens of Zephrians, mostly children and the elderly, shrank back as the armored humans entered, their large, dark eyes wide with terror. They had seen figures in armor before, and those figures had brought only pain and death. "Easy, everyone," Dr. Petrova said, her voice soft. She unlatched her helmet, letting it retract, revealing her human face. She offered a small, gentle smile. "We're here to help. You're safe now." She knelt before a small Zephrian child who was hiding behind its mother. The child flinched, pulling away. Petrova didn't move closer. Instead, she held out a nutrient paste packet, a simple offering. The child stared, its fear battling with its hunger. Slowly, hesitantly, it reached out a thin, blue-skinned hand and took the packet. It was a scene that repeated itself across the ruins. Human soldiers, the same soldiers who had just prosecuted a war with terrifying brutality, now moved with infinite gentleness. They passed out blankets, administered first aid, and spoke in low, reassuring tones. Dr. Petrova found herself treating an elderly Zephrian whose arm had been broken. As she worked, setting the bone and applying a medical brace, the old Zephrian watched her, his gaze full of a weary wisdom. "I remember," the old one whispered, his voice raspy. "A long time ago. Your people, they were so sick." Petrova looked up, her hands pausing. "Yes," she said quietly, "the Great Crimson Plague. My great-grandmother was a survivor. She was saved by one of your medical teams." Tears welled in the old Zephrian's eyes. He said, "We did what was right." "And now," Petrova replied, finishing her work and patting his hand gently, "so are we." In that moment, in a broken station surrounded by the ghosts of war, the great debt came full circle. It wasn't repaid by the thunder of cannons or the fury of admirals. It was repaid here, in small acts of kindness, in the shared understanding between a healer and a patient, between the descendants of the saved and the survivors of the saviors. 2 days later,
Admiral Sullivan was back on the bridge of the Nemesis, overseeing the vast humanitarian operation. An intelligence officer approached, his face grim. "Admiral," the young officer said, his voice tense, "we finished decrypting the primary data core from the progenitor." "Report," Sullivan ordered. The officer brought the data up on the main holotable. It was not a battle plan or a strategic document. It was a list. "We're calling it the harvest schedule, sir," the officer explained. "The Zephrians were first on the list because of their unique biology, but they weren't the last." A star chart materialized, and dozens of systems began to light up in a sickly red. The officer pointed to them one by one. The Pthar of the Cygnus system for their regenerative abilities, the silicates of the Orion arm for their resistance to radiation, every peaceful, biologically unique species in this quadrant of the galaxy. They were all slated for the same fate as the Zephrians. Sullivan stared at the map, the scope of the Ascendancy's genocidal ambition washing over him. This hadn't been a conquest. It had been the beginning of a galactic purge. They hadn't just won a battle for a single species. They had stumbled upon a war for the survival of dozens. The Zephrians' distress call hadn't just been a cry for their own salvation. It had been a warning for everyone.
Admiral Jake Sullivan stood alone on the observation deck, the star chart from the bridge still glowing in his mind. The Zephrians were safe. The rescue operation was nearly complete. His orders were to return to Earth, to receive a hero's welcome. The debt was paid. But looking out at the endless sea of stars, he knew it wasn't over. The names on that list, the Pthar, the Silicates, and all the others, they didn't know what was coming for them. They didn't know that somewhere out in the dark, another Ascendancy fleet might be on its way. They were defenseless, just as the Zephrians had been, just as humanity had once been. He made his decision. The Third Fleet would not be going home. Not yet. He returned to the bridge, his presence commanding immediate silence and attention. He walked to the central command chair and looked at his crew, his family, his weapon. "Helm," he said, his voice calm and clear, filled with a new, unyielding purpose. "Lay in a new course. Destination, the Cygnus system. Maximum speed." The helmsman looked up, surprised but unquestioning. "Aye, Admiral." As the mighty flagship Nemesis began to turn, leading the battered but resolute human fleet away from the world they had just saved and towards a new, unknown battle, the narrator's voice echoed the unwritten chapter of their future. They had answered a call meant for heroes, but in doing so, they had embraced a darker, more necessary role. They were no longer just soldiers. They were the monsters who hunted other monsters. They were the cure for a plague of conquest, and their work was just beginning. They were the galaxy's brutal, merciless, and unwavering immune system. And they would never stop until the sickness was purged.